Welcome to episode 9 of Royals at the Ranch. In this episode, we are going to meet our royals. I'm going to go over who our royals are and their roles here. In this photo, you see Sarek, which is one of our newer additions, but he's definitely the most outgoing royal python that we have here, so I'm sure that you're going to see much more of him in the future. Python Regius is the most produced, sold, and owned pet snake in the world. I went over this in a previous video, and if you're interested in finding out where those statistics came from, I have this paper by J.W. Valdez that is referenced right here, and I will also put that in the video description. We're going to start out by introducing you to Amun. He is one of the first two royal pythons that joined our group. He's a male. He is a banana piebald. He was hatched November 8th, 2019 and produced by TSK Inc. or the Snake Keeper. He arrived on March 24th, 2020, and he is here for habitat preference testing, and I'm also doing a behavior-based meal data tracking study with him. I'll explain that in just a minute. He is being target trained and currently eating mice and rats. He doesn't seem to have a preference for either or. This is Amunet. She's a female piebald royal python, and she is just a little bit older than Amun. She was hatched on August 12th, 2019, and she was produced by Keith Basilico at Disturbed Reptiles. She arrived on the same day as Amun, March 24th, 2020. They arrived for the same reason, which was primarily to do habitat preference testing. But she is also in this behavior-based meal study that I'm doing, and she's being target trained. She readily eats both mice and rats. Again, she doesn't seem to have a preference. So this behavior-based meal data that I'm collecting is being collected on both of these two animals, and I have been doing it since they arrived. So it's been over a year and a half now. And some things that I find very interesting are emerging as I look at the data, and I'm solely feeding them based on their behavior. That means they are actively hunting or actively foraging for food. Their behavior is telling me that they are literally hungry and they are expending more energy and time looking for food. They're not just doing it out of habit. And so sometimes they're eating very frequently. I have fed them as close together as 2 to 5 days. And then at other times, they're eating very far apart. It might be 2 weeks, 2 months, 20 days. And I'm just tracking this data, and some very interesting things are emerging where it seems that they will eat a lot very frequently for a period of time, and then they will go a long time without eating before they actively start hunting again. So this is something that I will go over for sure in a future video. This is Mesmer, and yes, Mesmer is an all-white snake. I think that all-white snakes are beautiful, but especially if they have black eyes like he does. He's a male super fire, which is also called a black-eyed leucistic. And he was hatched on August 6, 2020. He was produced by Wilbanks Reptiles and arrived on April 21st, 2021. He is my pet project, and he's actually here as a pet project. So I have him set up as I think a normal family would commonly set up a royal python that's going to live with them as a family pet. And I'm sort of working with him as I think a normal family would if they were following reasonable advice from a trainer or behaviorist. And I'm tracking his behavior and how quickly he progresses with things like being visible when the family's around, with training, with handling, and how he feeds. And he's also being target trained, and he is right now eating mice. This is Fulcrum, and you've seen Fulcrum in many videos. Fulcrum is our only adult royal python that we have here currently. He is a male. He's a caramel piebald. He was hatched in December of 2015, but the breeder didn't have the exact day for me. He was produced by Hudson River Reptiles, and he has spent his whole life there. He was hatched there in December 2015, and he remained there until he was sent here on April 21st, 2021. He is here for me to study how easy or difficult it is to transition an ex-breeding animal into an animal to be a family pet. He is a video star because he is accustomed to handling. He's relatively comfortable and relaxed with handling, and so he's been in some videos and he will be in more, and he's our token adult royal python. He is 5.5 years old, and all of our other royals are young, and that's because mostly what you find for sale are babies, and I actually prefer to get younger ones because they adjust much better than older animals. And one of the things that I'm finding out with Fulcrum is how to go about helping an animal adjust, that you get as an older animal that has known no other life than living in a rack and has not previously been part of a family. And so you're going to get to hear as his story progresses. Actually, last week's video was about him. It solely featured him and how he was doing after he'd been here a few weeks, and it shows him in quarantine, and I talked about him a little bit. So if you haven't caught that video, go back and look at episode 8 because it's all about Fulcrum. This is Sarek, and I have been waiting a long time to name a very special animal after one of my very favorite Star Trek characters, and that is Sarek. And this animal fits the bill. He is a very dark python Regius. Yes, I like all white snakes, but I also like black snakes and very, very dark colored snakes. And he's just gorgeous. He's a male leopard blackhead, black pastel. He has a ringer, which means he's got a little white mark around his tail that generally indicates they're heterozygous for piebald. And then he has these gorgeous gold markings that contrast so well with his black background. But that isn't the reason he's my favorite animal. Although he's gorgeous, he's extremely bold and outgoing and has an excellent temperament and personality for his species. He was hatched on June 11th, 2021, produced by CMM Constrictors, and he arrived on July 7th, 2021. So I was able to get him when he was very, very young, and he's still very young. So he was between 3 and 4 weeks old when I acquired him, and he is here for early training and early environmental enrichment. And what I'm looking at there is to see if exposing hatchlings to training and environmental complexity very, very early impacts their personality and behavior as they get older. And I was really lucky to get him at just over 3 weeks old. I think it would be awesome if a breeder would be able to do this study and have a clutch hatch just directly into an environmentally complex setting and start training them from the first feeding and expose them to as much environmental complexity as possible from the time that they hatch, and then compare them to others who were raised in a different environment when they're, say, 4 months old, 6 months old, a year old, and older, and see if they are better or equal at things like training and problem-solving tasks, and if they have a bolder, more outgoing personality. So that's what I'm checking out here with Sarek, and so far he's just doing amazing, and he's eating mice right now. This is Ahsoka, and she's our most recent addition to the same study that I just told you about with Sarek. So Ahsoka is a female. She's a black pastel, and she also has a ringer. You can see in this picture she has that white mark near her tail. She was hatched on July 2nd, 2021, produced by Regius Creations, and just arrived. She's here for early training and early environmental enrichment. And she was about, 7 weeks old when I got her. So both of these animals, Sarek and Ahsoka, were less than 8 weeks old when they arrived here. And I'm exposing them to a lot, and they're both dealing with that really, really well so far. As opposed to the others, Amun and Ammonette were like 4 and 7 months old when they arrived. And then Mesmer was around 8 or 9 months old when he got here. And then there's Fulcrum, who arrived here at 5.5 years old from a sparse environment where he was raised in Iraq with no environmental complexity, and he is taking a very long time to adapt. All right, now we're going to move into a special segment that we haven't done yet, and that's a training talk. So training is the action of teaching a person or animal a particular skill or type of behavior, and that is from dictionary.com. It always perplexes me why they say a person or animal, because a person is an animal. So I'm not sure why they just don't say the action of teaching an animal a particular skill or type of behavior, but that's the definition. I'm going to talk specifically about target training because I find it extremely useful, and it's one of the types of training that I start all of the animals with right away. And when I say all of the animals, I mean snakes, because I use something different for the dogs and horses, although they can be target trained, but I am doing target training with our cats. Anyway, target training is teaching an animal to touch a portion of their body to a target. And you might be asking, well, why would you do that? It's a foundation behavior, and once they learn how to do that, you can use that behavior to teach them all sorts of other things. And so a target is any object that you choose or designate as the target, but you want to choose one and stick with that one target for that one animal. And so the first step in target training, and I'm going to show you an example in a video, is to just pair your chosen target with a primary reinforcer. Food is usually the best one. And so I always start with food as a reinforcer for the snake training, and then as the learners get more advanced, I do use other things as reinforcement. So you are just going to pair the target with food. And if you're tong feeding, that means you're just going to hold the target behind the tongs and behind the food and let the animal see that it's there when you feed them. And you're not going to do anything else. And then if you're drop feeding, meaning that you're leaving the food in the enclosure with the snake and then leaving the room or standing by and watching while they eat it, you're just going to place the target in the enclosure and you're going to place the food on top of the target or next to the target. So it's really super easy for this first step. You're just pairing the target with food to get the snake to start associating that target with a primary reinforcer, or in this case, food. Uses for target training. Again, once the snakes learn to approach, follow, and wait at the target, you can use that behavior to do all sorts of other things. And here are some examples. And I have used the targeting behavior to do all of these things with snakes. You can use it for shifting them out of their primary habitat to temporary holding, shifting them out of their primary habitat to a station, to a scale, and then shifting them back into their habitat. You can get them to come out of hiding with targeting. You can recall them with targeting. So if they've gotten out, whether on purpose or you've let them out for exercise and you're ready for them to come back, you can recall them with the target. You can teach them to hold in place wherever you have paused the target. And while they're holding in place, you can then teach them to allow behaviors to be done to them, like injections, like blood draws, like touching, like microchip implants, physical exams, etc. You can signal feeding by using a target. You can teach them to station with a target. You can signal them with a target that they have an opportunity to come out of their enclosure and explore. And I have a specific target that I use for that behavior versus when they're going to get food as a reinforcement. You can use targeting to assess their health and fitness and as enrichment. So as they're doing this behavior and you know how they normally conduct themselves during the training sessions, if they're behaving abnormally, you're going to notice that. And then it's enriching for them because they're getting mental stimulation, they're getting physical exercise, they're getting sensory stimulation, and sometimes they're getting dietary enrichment, and they're definitely interacting with you socially, although not maybe in an affiliative way. They're interacting with you because you're training together in the session. And then you can cue the location of prey during other activities like foraging exercises, and I do use this with the pythons a lot. And they're just having a particularly difficult time finding where I've hidden the prey. I can show them the target at the location of that prey, and they will go to it and then be able to find it. So here's an example of a focal behavior, and if you were going to teach it, these are some sample steps that you could go through in order to teach the behavior. And so I'm going to go over shifting because that's the very first behavior that I ever taught a snake, and I use it so often, it's usually the first thing that I teach all the snakes. So these are some examples of approximations that you can teach. So once you've built an association with the target, the snake has now been classically conditioned to associate the target with food. They see the target and they associate it with food. Then you can move on to operant conditioning, which means that they have to perform some behavior in the environment or interact with the target in some way in order to earn the reinforcer, in this case, the food. So after you've paired the target with food, the second step is orienting the snake towards the target. So in other words, now we're just showing them the target, we're not pairing it with food, and as soon as they orient towards it, then we deliver the reinforcement. Step 3 would be we show them the target a distance away from them, and they not only orient towards it, but they move to the target. They move in its direction, and then we reinforce that. Step 4 is that they can follow that target. So they've oriented towards the target. They've started to move in the direction of the target to go to it, but now we're going to move the target, and they have to follow it to wherever we stop it. And then step 5 is to follow the target out of hiding, or maybe follow the target partially out of their enclosure. Step 6 would be to introduce a station or a shift box or whatever you're going to have them shift onto in the training environment so that they can see it as they're doing these other exercises, and eventually so that they can partially start to orient towards it and get reinforced for that, and then shift partially out onto it and get reinforced for that, until they're coming all the way out of their enclosure with their entire body and putting their whole body on the station or in the shift box or whatever it is that you're using. Maybe it's a transport container because you're going to take them somewhere. But now you've gone to just having them associate the target with food all the way to they will follow the target and shift out onto a station or a carrier or a shift box. Now, with some snakes, you may have to add intermediate approximations in between these that I've listed. So depending on how the learner is doing, you can add additional steps if you need to, or if the learner's just excelling and going really, really quickly, you may be able to skip steps, but that's going to depend on the individual learner. And we will go over these other steps in future videos. Next time on Royals at the Ranch, which is going to be our 10th episode already, I can't even believe it, we're going to return to our story of Amun and Ammonette, and we're going to pick up where we left off. So we left them off in their chondro tubs. So I had moved them from the breeder style tubs into chondro tubs, and Ammonette had escaped, but then I found her and they were doing well and excelling in their chondro tubs, and we're going to pick up from there and move on with their story and the behavior that I documented from them in their first few weeks here. And then we're going to have one of our special segments, and again, those are things like our training talk, our words on welfare, our behavior break, etc. And then, of course, we'll see Royals in your homes. Let's go to our Royals in your home segment right now, but before we do that, I want to remind you that if you want to include your Royals, either photos of them or a short video clip that's maybe 40 seconds or less, you can send those to BehaviorEducationLLC@gmail.com, or you can use Facebook Messenger to submit those photos or short videos to me, and they will be included in future segments. Everybody, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Royals at the Ranch. I hope to see you next week for episode 10. And if you have any questions for me, you can reach me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, or LinkedIn. And you can always email me or go to my website at BehaviorEducation.org. Everybody, thank you so much. Always be kind and love your animals.